I want to provoke you to think. I believe my job is to provoke you to think and maybe think a little differently. So I'm going to ask you tonight to have a little suspended disbelief in the best Hollywood tradition. You can always go back to the way you thought when I'm done. But if you find yourself in the stories I'm going to say tonight, what would you do differently? And finally, there is something called the perceived view of the future, and that has a tremendous influence on what we do in the present. When George Orwell wrote 1984 and put forth this concept called Big Brother, people in the Western worlds read this book and looked at each other and they said, there's no way we're going to let that happen. And we organized our view around the future of ensuring that Big Brother would never happen. Well, as you've already somewhat identified even today, you don't have privacy anymore. We organized our future around the fact that we would never have Big Brother, yet in the world as we live today, there's really no such thing as privacy, which I'll talk a little bit about more in a minute. And finally, it's much like being what some people think is a soothsayer, like Johnny Carson behind me. For those who aren't familiar, he was recently voted the #1 iconic television personality in the history of my colony. And one of the characters he would play was called Karnak the Magnificent. And Karnak would hold the envelope up to his head, and he would divine the answer to the question, not in your lifetime. And of course, he had a straight man, which I don't have here, who would repeat that question, and he'd make a funny move, and he'd rip open the envelope, and he would look at the question, which was, when will the United States win a soccer World Cup? Man, you guys are a tough audience. Well, so with that as my lead-in, let's move on. Well, no, come on, Johnny, it was pretty good, wasn't it? Okay. More than anything, this isn't about, a lot of people say this guy's an out-of-the-box thinker. It's not what it's about. It's about the question, why a box? You have to give yourself permission to ask questions like, why a box? You have to give yourself permission to think what I like to call 10x thinking. If you want to move from x to x plus 5 and you only look at x plus 5, you're only going to move to x plus 2. You've got to go to x plus 10. You'll bring it back, but give yourself that permission. It's extremely difficult to find that future if you don't give that permission to yourself. So let's give my 2 cents on the kinds of things you've heard the last 2 days, and then I am going to poke at you a little bit about some of the things that I think you could do to take all of that, to find that as a source of inspiration, and to move it forth to creating a whole new innovative way to think of what you do. So if we were to start by looking at the context, we'd have to remember things like, as was said yesterday, that there's more English-speaking people in China than all of North America, that this is the first time in history where children have knowledge their parents wish they had. If you don't have a kid at home right now, I'm willing to bet that your VCR is blinking 1200. See, I got a witness right here in the front. This is the very first time in history where the United States has been looked at as the most dangerous country in the world. This is, matter of fact, I think one of the most important things that happened in the last 3 years in the world, particularly in the first world, is that the actuarials changed the tables from 100 to 120. It used to be if you lived to be 100, you were off the chart, at least 101 day. Now the chart goes to 120. A small change in the mean from a average age span of 78 to 81 would mean a huge change in the end of the distribution with someone living to be 130 or more years. The only certainty today is a constant string of uncertainty. People don't go to work with any certainty they know how to do their jobs. People don't retire with any certainty they have enough money. In my country, when Franklin Roosevelt set the mandatory retirement age at 65, the average lifespan was 62. No wonder it worked. No wonder it worked. You know, we stand in front of God and say, "Till death do us part," with no certainty that I'll be here in 2 years, let alone have you be here in 2 years. And truth be told, I would like to present to you that the information age, or what was referred to as the digital age yesterday, has just concluded, has not just begun. So that we must push even further beyond that. When Steve talked about the Googleplex, We can't even tell what they're doing, let alone whether it's legal or not. I mean, how do you understand crime if you can't figure out if it's even being done? If you think of it in that way. And we have a world that would make Joseph Goebbels proud. Joseph Goebbels wanted a world that put fact and fiction together in a way that you couldn't tell them apart, where literally truth and fiction were inseparable. When you look at Wikipedia, which we talked about yesterday, there's no understanding whether or not what's in it is truth. Some of it's not. When you look at things like the Blair Witch Project, which was a documentary and also known to be fiction, can you please tell me how you document fiction? Or how a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author who writes a biography of Ronald Reagan writes himself into it as a fictional character. This is the kind of world that we're living in to a degree that we've become culturally schizophrenic. And to me, cultural schizophrenia is the modern condition of the separation between attitudes and behaviors, or the recognition intuitively that the world as it presents itself is not the world as we understand it to be. And so we've come to a point where our human condition, the zeitgeist, is driven by the fact that there's a consensus not to have a consensus about anything that's going on. That, in effect, the pendulum of humanity is not the movement between conservative and liberal. In my country, we don't have Republicans and Democrats, we have Remocrats and Dupublicans, which is a very funny line. The pendulum of humanity is the move towards consensus or the move towards the endpoints. It's more like this motion. And we're heading towards the endpoints without any institutional guidance as to where we should stop. At the same time, and it's both at the same time, and the one end has, extreme fundamentalism, and let's say abstinence, and at the other end you have Ozzy Osbourne as the poster child for fatherhood. I mean, how do we get to that? And so we have literally, as a context, gotten to the point where what we really have the most is an abolition of context. There are no agreed-upon social norms. We have no social norms, and there's a crisis of confidence in both institutions and in authority. If it was 1960, and I asked everybody in this room to identify who was the best rocket scientist in the world, everyone who would have made an answer, because some people wouldn't know, but anyone who answered would have said Wernher von Braun. If I asked you who is the number one rocket scientist in the world today, who would you say? I don't think anyone would know a name to even put there, although maybe some of us would. And so we have gotten to a point where if you think about reality, and take a good look at that picture, if you think about reality, there is no longer one reality because everybody can make their own. That was the real message of the Unabomber. He made his own reality. Actually, the real message of the Unabomber was that going to Harvard's no longer a guarantee. But thank you very much over here for that. And we've hit the point where we're living in a world that has become autocatalytic. Change has become autocatalytic. It's not about the rate of change or the amount of change. Change is feeding itself. It's kind of like the weather at Mount Everest. You can't predict the weather at Mount Everest because it makes it in real time, moment to moment to moment. It's the same kind of thing. And you must, as much as it would probably make John Locke roll over in his grave, give up on logic. Not that it doesn't exist anymore, but it's no longer the dominant organizing premise to society. And if you think about this for you, it made me think of the role of the outlaw and what James Joyce wrote, the great Irish writer of Ulysses, considered perhaps, actually he was recently named as the greatest writer of all time, with Twain or Samuel Clemens being only second, that civilization may be said indeed to be the creation of its outlaws. Do you have a different relationship going forward with the outlaw than perhaps you had recently? And you must recognize today that authority is not a thing. Authority is a process. It's an interpretive process to which we seek the solidity of a thing. that it's not carte blanche anymore, that authority is your mandate just as a result of what you do for a living. You have to have that be redefined as we go forth into this new world.